Starting in this chapter, we're going to need to use something called the general journal. So what we've been doing so far is recording transactions in these tables, and they don't really have a name, we just sort of made them up, but they're called transaction tables, and then into the general ledger. So a transaction like this, cash payment of $4,000 for rent plus GST, paid with check 123, we've been putting it in this table first. So for example, we'd have rent, which is an expense going up, so that would be a debit. We'd have GST clearing, which is a liability, and it would go down because we're being charged GST and paying it, so that would be a debit. And then we'd have the cash, which is an asset, going down, and that would be a credit. Debits equal credits. And what we've been doing then is putting them in these ledgers. So in this case, rent, GST clearing, and cash. So we'd go to rent and do a debit. We'd go to GST clearing and do a debit. And we go to cash and do a credit. And we've got our debits equal our credits. The last thing we've been doing is putting our references in. So under rent, I'd write the reference of cash. Under GST, I'd write cash. And for cash, I'd do a double reference, rent/GST. And if we could just summarize what we've been doing, these are transaction tables, and then we've been putting them in the general ledger. Well, this is something we need to know. This is the thing, the general ledger. We need to know how to fill our ledgers in. But this table is not a thing in our subject. So what we've got to do is say, well, we've got to record them in something. If it's not this transaction table, what is it? Well, what we've been doing so far is doing all these transactions happen in their source documents. That's stage one. We've been recording them, and we've been doing it into the ledgers. Then we've been doing a trial balance to see if debits equal credits, and then we produce our reports, and lastly we make decisions. Well, we're just going to change stage two, this recording of transactions, just slightly. And instead of doing these transaction tables and then putting them into the general ledger or the ledger accounts, what we're going to do instead is something called the general journal. And we'll look at how to fill this in the next video. But for now, a transaction like we just did, cash payment of $4,000 for rent plus GST, paid with check 123, we'd actually do our debits and credits in here. So we'd start with the date. We'd go rent is an expense, and it would be a debit. GST clearing was a liability. It was a debit of $400. And then we had one entry to the cash ledger, and it was a credit. And then we do something called a narration. So we'd write paid monthly rent and the document number, which is check 123. Now we'll learn how to actually do this part in the next video. But what we'll do now is we'll actually record these transactions in the general journal, and then we'll do what's called post them or transfer them to the general ledger. So that's a slight difference to what we've been doing. So really, stage two now is slightly different. Transactions will happen, we'll record them in the general journal, then we'll enter them or post them in the general ledger, which is all of our ledger accounts. So what is the general journal? It's not really a definition we need to know, but I guess we could say it's an accounting record used to analyze and record each individual transaction of the business before they are recorded in the ledger account. So we can see here we've got the general journal, date, account, debits, credits. We entered that transaction, so we can sort of analyze whether we've got it right here. Do our debits equal our credits? And we do that before we put it in the ledgers. It also identifies the source document, so we're going to put something called the narration here, and it tells us what the source document is. And lastly, we use this to post this information to the ledger accounts in the general ledger, just like we always have been. Instead of the transaction tables though, we're going to record all our transactions from now on in the general journal.